All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. Today I'm really excited to talk with Greg Nuckols, who is a powerlifter, writer, and just overall knowledge provider in the fitness industry. And I'm not really sure if this is the best intro, but I gave it my best. So, Greg, thank you so much for taking the time today, and how are you doing?
I'm doing great, and I thought that intro was just fine. The intro I typically give myself is, "Hi, I'm Greg. Let's do this thing."
Awesome. Yeah, that's perfect. Perfect and humble. So, yeah, Greg, how are things going for you these days?
They're pretty good. They're pretty good. Currently trying to finish up my master's program or finish my master's degree. Would not necessarily recommend someone try to go to grad school while also attempting to run two businesses. So very busy. Not sleeping the most. But on the whole, life is good. Life is good, and I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, so that's also a plus.
Awesome. Yeah, well, yeah, that in that case, I appreciate even more that you took the time to talk with me today. So cool. So let's basically jump into this topic that I want to pick your brain on today, which is on your recent work with regards to training frequency. So for anybody who doesn't know, but probably a lot of people who will listen to this know that in recent years, basically the general consensus was that 2 or 3 times a week training frequency per muscle group seems to be the most optimal. But even more recent work basically showed that the typical bro split, when you just hit something once a week, might be just as good. So, and you came to a slightly different conclusion. So first of all, what is the conclusion that you came to? And what would you say you did differently than the people who came to those previous conclusions that I just mentioned?
So the biggest thing is that there has been an explosion in the amount of research looking at the effects of training frequency on both muscle growth and strength gains in the last, just 6 months or so. I want to say that as of 7-8 months ago, there were maybe 6 or 7, I think 6 good volume matched frequency studies out there. And then within the past 6, 7, 8 months, that number's jumped to 13 or something like that. So the body of literature has doubled or more than doubled. So I think one of the reasons that I came to slightly different conclusions than prior attempts to synthesize that body of research is just now there's more research out there. So I think that was part of it. And I'll also note there's apparently at least 3 or 4 more frequency studies in the pipeline from Brad Schoenfeld and colleagues that, in talking to James Krieger, might flip the conclusions again. So who's really to say? But for the time being, as it stands now, it appears that training frequency has at least a semi-linear effect on both strength gains and hypertrophy, with no obvious plateau at a particular frequency. The one issue with that is a lot of studies look at frequencies with frequencies of discretely 1 time per week, 2 times per week, or 3 times per week. And then there are a decent number of studies, I think 5 or 6, 4 or 5, I think, that have even higher frequencies than that. So frequencies of 4, 5, or 6 times per week. But there aren't that many that use a frequency of precisely 4 times per week, or precisely 5 times per week, or precisely 6 times per week. So past that point, there's not enough evidence to really be able to say for sure. But when we kind of pool all of those 4+ times per week frequencies together, it does seem that 4+ times per week may also still be slightly better than 2 or 3 times per week. But once you get past 3 times per week, there's not enough research yet to speak with too much granularity. But yeah, for the most part, it seems that the frequency is pretty cool. Yeah, seems to have a not black and white effect. I think that one thing that's important when you're talking about really anything related to program design and how much something is actually going to affect your progress in the gym, I think it's important to make sure that you contextualize the magnitude of an effect you can expect. So I think as far as strength goes, the core driving programming variable is going to be intensity, percentage of 1 rep max. For hypertrophy, I think the most important thing is certainly still volume. So I'm not saying that like this turns everything on its head and volume doesn't matter for hypertrophy. It's just how often you train. Like, no. But if you take a certain level of volume and distribute it over more days per week, it seems that may help with hypertrophy a bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. So then it begs the question, what would you, I mean, you obviously wrote about these things, a lot of the questions that I'm going to be asking you, you answered this in that really awesome meta-analysis that you wrote up on your site, but what would you attribute these benefits to with higher training frequencies?
I am not quite sure. So starting with strength, because that's what I'm the most familiar with and the most comfortable with. The first place most people's brains would go is like, oh, maybe it helps you get stronger because it helps you build more muscle, which is possible, but I would need to go back and actually like run that analysis to see if like maybe if the studies that do report the largest gains in hypertrophy also reported the largest differences, or if the studies that reported the largest hypertrophy differences between frequency conditions also reported the largest differences in strength gains between conditions, I think that would be evidence to that effect. I did my analysis of strength stuff first, and when I was doing that, I was laboring under the assumption that frequency didn't affect hypertrophy all that much, because that is what the most recent meta-analysis had said. But again, the most recent meta-analysis wasn't privy to literally the majority of the literature, at least as far as volume match studies go, because so many volume match studies came out after that meta-analysis was published. So I didn't look into that for strength. So that may have an effect, but I would need to go back and analyze it. My hunch is that the two kind of like core driving factors that would explain why higher frequencies may be beneficial for strength gains are that one, you're just getting more frequent practice, and a lot of strength is just skill acquisition and skill development and just getting better at whatever exercises you're doing. And frequency of practice for most motor skills tends to be a pretty important factor. And then I think the other thing is that even if training volume is the same, if you're just looking at like volume load or total number of sets completed, or even like total number of reps completed, I don't think that tells you the entire story, because even if you use like the same weight for the same number of reps, the quality of those reps, I think, is important. And so this is kind of like a wishy-washy statement, and I recognize that. Like, as a coach, like, you can tell if people are like really like engaged and going hard in their training, or if they're kind of just like going through the motions and maybe letting their foot off the gas a little bit, so they're like conserving energy for the end of their session or something like that. And I think that is more likely to play a role with lower frequencies. Like, so per session volume is higher, and so you might not put as much into every set, just because you have more to get through in that session. And I think if you want to kind of approach that same idea using like a little bit more quantitatively instead of qualitatively, I think that there's probably going to be a difference in force output and bar velocity per rep. So if you lift 400 pounds for a rep, you're not just flatly applying 400 pounds of force the whole time. If you did, the bar wouldn't go anywhere. So if you get the bar, like if you accelerate it really fast, force is mass times acceleration. So if you accelerate it really explosively and reach high bar velocities, force output per rep is higher than if you lift it at slower velocities and a little bit more lackadaisically. And what you tend to see is bar velocity and force output drops off set to set, even if the weight and the number of reps is the same. So if you calculate something like impulse, I think I think total weekly impulse would be higher with higher frequencies and lower per session volumes, just because you're not going to be accruing and accumulating as much fatigue for each muscle group and each exercise within each session. So even if volume is the same, I think total weekly force output and average weekly force output will probably tend to be higher with higher frequencies and lower per session volumes. And so I think that also helps contribute to strength development. As far as hypertrophy goes, I'm honestly kind of scratching my head. And actually, let me just go back to strength real quick. Just kind of to argue against myself real quick, I'm somewhat skeptical of the degree to which those explanations actually fully explain everything that's going on. Because another one of the findings was that training frequency seems to matter more for upper body strength gains and less for lower body strength gains, or potentially not at all for lower body strength gains. And so this is just based on my experience here, but most people tend to be pretty good at the bench press. And that's the exercise that was used most often in these studies. And most of them used trained lifters. And so, most people who've been in the gym for 6 months, like they may not have like IPF champion level bench press technique, but they're relatively proficient at the bench press. Like it's not a difficult exercise. You lay on the back, you grab the bar, lower to your chest, push it away from you, bada boom, bada bing, you got it. So if this is predicated on skill acquisition, especially, I wouldn't expect the effect for the bench press to be nearly as large as the effect for the squat. And most of the lower body measures of strength gains were the squat. I think one of the studies used leg press and one of them used like machine hack squat, but for the most part it was squatting. And I do think, squats also aren't like unbelievably technical, but I think most people struggle with technique and just have a little bit harder time mastering the motor pattern of squats than bench. So if anything, if it was predicated especially on skill acquisition, I would expect it to have a larger effect for squat than bench. So that one honestly has me scratching my head a little bit. And then as far as hypertrophy goes, so the kind of mental schema I was working with coming into this analysis was that frequency would probably matter more for trained lifters than untrained lifters, because it seems that elevations in muscle protein synthesis go back to baseline a little bit quicker in trained lifters. And so, maybe like, let's say a frequency of twice per week, maybe muscle protein synthesis is elevated for 72 hours post-workout in untrained people. So their muscle protein synthesis is elevated above baseline for 6 days a week if they're just training twice a week. But with trained lifters, maybe for a similarly challenging workout, it's only elevated for 48 hours. So, there's 3 days per week that their muscle protein synthesis wouldn't be elevated above baseline if they were only training twice per week. So, maybe they should train 3-4 times per week to always stay in kind of a general growth state. And the other thing is I assumed that frequency would matter more for higher volume training than lower volume training, because I was kind of working with the assumption that there is a dose response relationship between like volume in a given session and muscle protein synthesis, but from what I've seen, doesn't seem to be perfectly linear. So you do one set, you get a MPS response. You do 2 sets, MPS response is higher than 1 set, but not twice as high. You do 3 sets, MPS response is higher than 2 sets, but it's not an additional 50% higher. So there's a dose response relationship, but it's not linear. So I was thinking it has to not necessarily fully plateau, but you have to probably reach a point at some point where the additional marginal benefit of each additional set within a given session is small enough that it really doesn't matter if you did it or not. But if you moved that set to another session where maybe it is the first set of that session, the marginal benefit would be much higher. So I anticipated that, if you're doing 20 sets a week or something, if you split that up as, and I'm working with the assumption that's reasonably high volume. If you split that up as 4 sets, 5 days a week, I would expect that would be better than 10 sets, 2 days per week. And that would make a larger overall difference than, say, 10 weekly total sets, comparing 5 sets 2 days per week to 2 sets 5 days per week. However, both of those assumptions were completely wrong. It seemed that the effect of frequency on hypertrophy was larger for untrained lifters than trained lifters, and larger for overall lower volumes of training than higher volumes of training. And I'm just going to be honest with you. I speculated some mechanisms in the article, but I don't know the degree to which they can actually explain those findings, because those two things. So I think that in a general sense, frequency of muscle protein synthesis stimulation probably does largely explain these effects. Like I can't see how that wouldn't be the driving mechanism. But I personally still have a lot of unresolved questions, because what I found largely went counter to my assumptions going into it, and I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around it and figure out why things shook down the way they did.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, anytime there is a finding that is kind of striking but is really cool at the same time, like, part of me at least is always wondering, like, is there something that we are missing which would explain why these results seem like this on paper but they aren't like that actually in real life? Or is it actually the case and we just don't understand why? So, like, how confident you are actually, given what you found, that this in practice is actually how it's working out, so that untrained lifters benefit more from higher frequency and lower volume training benefits more from higher frequency?
So I hope I understood your question. Internet started cutting out a little bit there. So I think that one thing that it's important to note, that most people probably wouldn't note, is that there's always a chance that you wind up with a false positive. And I think that chance is a lot higher than most people realize. So there was actually a reproducibility study in the social sciences that just came out like last week. And so it tried to replicate 21 like important seminal findings published in Nature, really high impact journal, over the last like 10 years in social sciences. And of the 21 studies, only 13 of the results actually replicated. And the mean effect size for the replication attempts was only half as large as the as the original studies. So, like, yeah, I think that people see p values and they see p less than 0.05 and interpret that as, oh, there's a 95% chance that this finding is a true positive and not a false positive. But that's not the case. So yeah, one possibility is that I came to incorrect conclusions, and that's not on me for analyzing the data wrong. It's just on just sampling variability and just a random false positive, because that happens. It happens not infrequently. It happens in every field, and I think people just aren't aware about that and don't. And are too hesitant to admit that that's a possibility. So yeah, that could be all it is. And then another possibility is that, like you said, maybe the mental models that I was working with are just wrong. And if that's the case, I've put a lot of thought into this, and I can't figure out mechanistically, based on my understanding of muscle physiology, I can't figure out a mechanistic reason to explain what's going on. And that could be an issue with me. Like, good explanations could be out there and I'm just completely unaware of them. Or it could just be that there's some physiological stuff going on that just we as a field don't understand yet. So yeah, overall, the confidence I would put in the general finding that strength, especially upper body strength, is positively influenced by training frequency, I'm quite confident in that, like 80% plus. The general finding that hypertrophy is positively influenced by training frequency, maybe not up to super high frequencies like 5-6 times per week, but up to at least like maybe 3-4 times per week. Reasonably confident in that. Like I'd say somewhere between 60 to 80% confident. My confidence in 2+ times per week being better than just once per week is probably closer to like 90-95%. In terms of the actual specifics of like the sub-analyses, like frequency mattering more for untrained lifters than trained lifters, that's where the evidence leans, and I'd put my confidence in those findings above 50%, because I don't think there's a justifiable reason to put it below 50%. But that would be closer to like, somewhere between 50 and 65%, and not up in the 80-90% range.
Sure. That makes total sense. So, speaking about hypertrophy still, like, and you also talked about this in your article, but how much would you say that upping frequencies up to like 3, 4, maybe even 5, 6 is a win-win? Like, what is kind of the cost benefit? And yeah, like if you could address this both from a theoretical scientific perspective and both from a practical real life perspective, that would be really cool.
If it's okay with you, I'm just going to address it from kind of a real life perspective, because I think that that's what's going to matter the most for the listeners.
Sure.
So, never mind. I'll throw some theory in as well. So ultimately, I think that as far as applying these findings go, or really applying the findings of any research, you need to keep in mind individual variability. And I think that people tend to dramatically underestimate the degrees to which individual variability can matter. So I think a lot of people realize that, like, hey, some people just respond better to training than others. You could train the way Ronnie Coleman did and take all the drugs Ronnie Coleman did, but if you're listening to this, there's like a 99.999% chance that you would not wind up looking like Ronnie Coleman. Similarly, you can train and eat the same way Ray Williams does, and you would not lift as much as Ray Williams. People realize that there's variability in how good generally people respond to training. I think that people are a little bit less aware of the fact that there's also variability in how well people respond to particular styles of training. I think one reason that this is a blind spot is there is just less research on it generally. But there is definitely research out there supporting the fact that people respond better or worse to different styles of training. And so I think that when interpreting results, like here and also just elsewhere in life, it's important to keep that in mind. So on average, higher frequencies may be beneficial for strength development and hypertrophy. For you personally, they may not. And my advice to anyone when it comes to applying scientific results to your own training is use science as a means of identifying ways that you should troubleshoot when you plateau, but don't just like proactively apply everything you read. I think that progress is the most precious outcome variable for a given individual. And if you're on a training program and it has you training every exercise or every muscle group just once a week, and you're making solid progress on that, just don't worry about frequency for the time being. Like you have clear evidence that what you're doing is working for you. Just stick with it. And then when you plateau and you're thinking like, oh, I've plateaued now, not making gains anymore, what variables should I potentially look into adjusting to start making progress again? Then you go and look at something like this and be like, oh, there's evidence that training frequency may positively impact strength gains and hypertrophy. So maybe I'll try to increase my frequency. And that's maybe how I'll be able to get progress going again. I think that that's a good way to look at this, and not necessarily like, oh, like you read this article, you need to overhaul your entire training program to train every lift 5 times per week proactively. Like, I think that that's silly. And also, if you try higher frequency and it doesn't work for you, that doesn't mean that science is wrong. Like, you could just be someone who doesn't take well to higher frequency, and like that's also totally fine. So yeah, that's I guess more theoretical, part practical. The other practical consideration is I think it depends heavily on kind of your own psychological profile, and just how you prefer to train and how good you are at holding yourself back. So, let's say you're someone who like all of the Instagram cliches apply to you. Like, you go to the gym to slay your demons and you want to just crush yourself every time you go and like train a particular body part, just all that stuff. I may sound derisive because that's not how I'm wired at all, but like if that's you, you do you, man. In that case, I don't think high frequency is probably the best approach for you, because if every time you want to train legs, you want to have to like hobble out of the gym, and that's just like what a proper leg training day feels like to you, and kind of holding yourself back would just not feel like a proper training session. You probably shouldn't train legs 5 times a week. That's probably a good approach for getting injured at worst, and just kind of spinning your wheels and low grade overtraining at best. So yeah, I think if you like to get a little bit crazy in the gym, always go to failure, do enough volume that you just feel like you've absolutely fried whatever muscle groups you're training. The low frequency approach is probably best. Like, I think that is not, I wouldn't go quite as far as to say fundamentally incompatible with high intensity training, but if you can get away with high frequency with that general type of approach, I think that would just mostly be a matter of being lucky, and being able to recover much better than the typical person. On the other hand, if you are a little bit better at being more restrained and analytical with your training, like you don't feel like you have to go to failure every set, you don't feel like you have to crush yourself to have had a productive workout, then I think that a higher training frequency can be a lot more compatible with your general psychological profile. So I'd say that's the primary practical takeaway. Like, I think that in theory, on average, higher frequencies are better. I think in practice, some people just aren't suited for it psychologically, because the general training style necessitated by higher frequencies just wouldn't be enjoyable and fulfilling. And if they trained in a way that was enjoyable for them with really high frequencies, they'd probably snap their shit up.
Right. So you mentioned that if your progress is good, then don't bother. But what if someone's progress is pretty good on once or twice a week frequency, but they just read your analysis and they're like, well, there's always the chance that I could be making even better progress. So they try out training 4 or 5 days a week. So like, what would be the type of population for whom you would say, like, just definitely do not bother doing this?
Definitely do not bother. That's a good question. So I would say maybe older people. My analysis was restricted to volume and intensity match studies in healthy young adults, young to middle aged. I think one study included people up to like 40 or 50 years old, but like nothing older than that. So I didn't necessarily read all of the frequency research in older adults, like people 60 plus, when doing this article, but based on the stuff I've read in that population, just kind of over time, it doesn't seem that frequency has as positive of an impact on them, and it may even be deleterious past maybe like 2 hard workouts per week or so. My friend Cody Hahn was a co-author on a paper recently looking at this in older adults, where basically one group did 3 pretty hard workouts per week, and the other group did 2 pretty hard workouts per week, and then the third workout, like they still got in the gym and did a little something, but it was like low intensity, fairly low volume, not close to failure. So like kind of like a feeder workout almost. And the group that went hard 3 days did not make as good of progress as the group that only had like 2 tough sessions per week. And man, I seem to remember at least one other paper having pretty similar findings. But again, I think individual variability still applies. So like just because it seems that on average higher frequencies probably aren't as beneficial for older adults, like there are probably older adults who would still like respond better to higher frequencies, but just playing the averages work in the opposite direction for them, if that makes sense. So just as like there are certainly still young adults who probably do better with lower frequencies, there are probably certainly still older adults that do better on higher frequencies, but it's just the odds of that occurring are lower, if that makes sense. And other than that, I can't, like older adults and people who just kind of like to train a little bit crazy. Like those are the people who I generally wouldn't recommend higher frequencies for. But I also wouldn't claim that applies like in all cases at all times.
Sure. Now, what is your, I mean, obviously you're more personally involved with powerlifting, but what do you think about the implications for connective tissue and tendon and joint health? Personally speaking, I found that if I train something more than like 4 days a week, and even up to like 4 days a week, even if I just train my upper body in general, I just find that my shoulders and my elbows, by just constantly pounding them with loads throughout the week, they just get incrementally more flared up. But I just might be a negative outlier. So what do you think about connective tissue and joint integrity with higher frequency training in the context of hypertrophy still?
Man, that's a good question. I think... So, with the disclaimer that is not squarely within my wheelhouse, my understanding is basically that it's is that like tendon health, and I know more about tendons than ligaments and like cartilage. I'm not even going to speculate about them. It's my understanding that kind of like tendon remodeling and strengthening works in a way that's not dissimilar to skeletal muscle. It just tends to happen a little slower and on slightly longer timescales. And I think it would largely come down to kind of the degree of stress you're placing on your tendons within each workout, such that like, you know, if you cause like, let's say X amount of damage within a workout, and let's say your tendons can recover from X amount of damage within 48 hours, then, you know, if you train 2 days later, like that's kind of in balance, like recovery matches stress and things are good. If you wind up putting like more stress on your tendons within that workout, like let's say you put 2X amount of stress and you still can recover from X amount of stress within 48 hours, then yeah, if you train again, you start kind of digging yourself a hole. You'd induce additional stress when you hadn't fully recovered and repaired from that prior stressor. So I think that in general, it probably doesn't necessarily increase risk of joint injuries. Like if you look at some of the research looking at injury risk and like acute on chronic training loads, it seems that variation in training volume, like jacking your volume up like 30-40% overnight, is a much stronger predictor of injury than distribution of training loads. So I think that on average, it doesn't necessarily increase risk, assuming volume's equated. So, you know, assuming that increasing frequency doesn't also come with an increase in volume. But again, like I think individual variability applies. Like I think that it, you know, may be riskier for some people, but I don't think it's inherently riskier on average. But again, that's a good question. That's not a question in an area that's like fully within my wheelhouse. So I could be completely wrong.
Sure. And just another question, which also might not be completely up your alley, but I'll ask it nevertheless. What do you think is, like there have been a lot of interesting discussions about the diminishing returns effect of volume within any given session. And I guess a practical question off of that is like, what is sort of the upper threshold, assuming, pretty hard training, like 1 or 2 reps in reserve kind of sets for the most part, like what would be the most amount of sets beyond which it's highly conceivable, at least, that there's a strong diminishing returns effect? And perhaps with that, like, what's the lower threshold? Like, is 1 set enough, or 2 sets, or what would be your like practical and maybe theoretical recommendation there?
Oh man, that's a good question. That's a good question that I don't have a concrete answer to, and I don't think anyone does. However, I think I can confidently say that at least the upper limit is quite individual. So for example, Brad Schoenfeld just published another study like 2 days ago or something, 2-3 days ago, looking at weekly volumes, but like higher weekly volumes obviously means like higher per session volume as well. Up to like the highest volume group was doing like 45 sets per muscle group per week, and I think that was split up as like 15 sets per day, which is above the range where most people would posit that marginal benefits are incredibly small. And that study still found increased benefit for up to like that level of volume. I think the 3 levels of volume used in that study were like 9 sets per week, 24 sets per week, and like 45 sets per week, with like differences in per session volume scaling with that as well. On the flip side, and so like that's an example of like, it seems like there were still marginal benefits there up to really quite high volumes. Like if you divided, say, total hypertrophy by sets performed per session, like you can see that marginal benefit per set is still dropping off. Like it's not like the 45 set per week group grew almost twice as much as the 24 or 27 set per week group or whatever it was. So yeah, like marginal benefits are dropping off, but it still seems like there are marginal benefits there. On the flip side, there was a paper looking at German volume training versus basically half German volume training. Actually, I think there have been 2 papers looking at that, basically like 10 sets of 10 versus 5 sets of 10. And I want to say that in those papers, it was just like one exercise per muscle group. So it would be like 10 sets within a session versus 5 sets within a session, I believe 2 or 3 times per week. And those studies found either similar hypertrophy between like the 10 sets per session and 5 sets per session, or in some measures, maybe even slightly more hypertrophy with the 5 sets per session than the 10. So like those results are completely opposite from the results that Dr. Schoenfeld just got. But there were differences in training statuses between those 2 studies. Like the guys in the German volume training study were like not untrained, but kind of like semi-trained, I guess. And the people in Brad's study, like they weren't elite bodybuilders, but they seem to be of a higher training status than the folks in the German volume training studies. So yeah, like I think that there is like a decrease in marginal returns with increased sets that really kind of, it probably starts on set 2. Like I think the benefits of set 2 are probably smaller than the benefits of set 1. And then you kind of get like a logarithmic type curve of like total accrued benefits past that. But I think the area where it starts flattening out, and then I guess it wouldn't be entirely logarithmic because at some point it turns negative. Like if you do 100 sets per session, like 4 times per week, like you're probably going to atrophy from that. Like that's just way overboard. So I think that the area where that curve starts flattening and eventually turns negative, I think that's strongly impacted by training status. Like I think that for an untrained lifter, you may hit the point of diminishing returns by like, I don't know, 4 or 5 sets for a given muscle group. Like the repeated bout effect stuff hasn't built up yet. Like you're just new to training. And, maybe if you do a couple more sets, you could get some more benefits. But really, 4 or 5 sets per session, it's probably fine. It's probably fine. Whereas if you're way more well-trained, I still think the general curve would look the same. Like, I think you get more benefit from set 1 than set 2, more from set 2 than set 3, and so on. Excuse me. But I think that the point that curve really starts flattening out and marginal benefits start approaching 0, I honestly don't know. Like, and I think it could be really quite high. Like, it might be like not 10, 15 sets per week. It might be 10, 15 sets per session. And so, yeah, like, I think it's impossible to give a concrete number of, like, for everyone, this is about how many sets you need to do per session. I think that it's going to be much higher for people who are more well-trained. And I think even within given levels of training status, I think that there's probably individual variability as well. So, yeah, I'm sure that's probably not a good answer for the listeners, because you can't really take that and apply it, like, directly to yourself. Like, oh, how many sets should I do per session? I don't know, somewhere between 5 and 20. So yeah, that's probably unhelpful. But yeah, I think there's probably a pretty big range for an untrained person. Maybe a rule of thumb, 4 or 5 sets. For a more well-trained person, 10-ish sets, maybe 8, 10, 12, somewhere around there per session, per muscle group. But yeah, just know that your mileage may vary. Might be higher or lower for you.
Sure thing. Before I ask you my final 1 or 2 questions, do you have a hard stop in the next couple of minutes, or I don't want to be too abusive of your time, more so than I have been already?
I need to be off by 2, but that's 49 minutes from now, so you're good.
Okay, cool. I'll try to be efficient, nevertheless.
Okay.
So just to throw out another softball at you, what personally, how do you, you just mentioned the German volume training study, and now the new study from new analysis from Schoenfeld. So what do you make of these crazy high numbers that just came out in the recent data? Because that's, volume was always thought to be one of the key components to hypertrophy, but not to these crazy, by these crazy margins that we just seem to have discovered in these latest data.
So I think that there's a bit of a disconnect between research and what people kind of observe in the real world. So I think that within the bro community, there are like high intensity training, Arthur Jones zealots who are like, low volume's the way to go, 1 set to failure, blah, blah, blah. But I think that kind of within the bodybuilding world, the overall tenor tends to probably favor maybe excessive levels of volume that potentially might only be possible with chemical enhancements. So I think that the pendulum in the bodybuilding world might be swung a little bit too far in the really high volume direction. But on the flip side, you do also see a lot of people training with crazy high volumes and still making progress. The meta-regression from 2016, 2017 that Brad and James Krieger and others did found finding that there were quasi-linear increases in hypertrophy with increased volume up to at least 10 sets per week. I think that a lot of people saw that and saw that as up to 10 sets per week, period, 10 is the number. Whereas they just didn't have enough studies with even higher volumes than that to really analyze much. But yeah, I mean, if you look at what people are doing in the real world, there's not much research looking at 20, 30, 40 sets per week. But there are a lot of people who are doing 20, 30, 40 sets per week per muscle group and still making progress. So they might not be training, well, they're almost definitely not training the most efficient way, going back to marginal benefits with each additional set. They've probably hit the point of diminishing returns, but their volume's also not so high that they're not still making progress. And they may still be in the realm of positive marginal returns. They could just be very small positive marginal returns, per additional set they're doing. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's all that crazy. And so that's the bodybuilding side of things. On the strength side of things, if you look at the Eastern European lifting tradition, or even just like what Mike T is doing or Mike Teixeira is doing with his guys at Reactive Training Systems. Like their volumes tend to be really high, and like there are thousands. I was going to say if not tens of thousands. That might be overstating it, but there are at least thousands of people who have tried really high volume Shaco style approaches to powerlifting, who've gotten really good results from it. Mike and his guys have coached, again, probably thousands of people, including like several world champions with really high volume approaches. So yeah, like I'm not too shocked at the research findings. Like I won't be shocked by a research finding in trained lifters finding increased benefits with higher volumes up to really quite high volumes, because you see it in the real world. I would be pretty surprised if, say, you test 50 sets per week in untrained lifters and they find that that's like super great. I would be pretty shocked by that. But yeah, like there just hasn't been much research in this general area using fairly highly trained lifters or just fairly high volumes. So I think it's less surprising in light of the literature that we're seeing that now. And I think it's more just a gap in the literature that's finally being filled that matches what you see in the gym.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That's a great response. And another thing I was looking forward to pick your brain on for a second is I remember reading an article from you back in the day, which was grow like a new lifter again. And I kind of recall you saying that you changed your views on that somewhat. So what do you think about the concept in general of deconditioning or detraining purposefully for a while to kind of grow again as if you were like a fresher lifter with less training experience?
So I haven't necessarily changed my view. I need to reword that article though, because like when I wrote that article, I very much intended for it to be a hypothesis. And so like just to lay it out for all of the listeners, one of the things okay, I don't know if many people have actually thought about like why do people eventually stop growing, like mechanistically. Like there aren't that many muscle protein synthesis studies in trained lifters, but the stuff we do have seems to indicate that they lift weights. Muscle protein synthesis doesn't increase as much as it does for untrained lifters, but it still does increase. And muscle protein breakdown doesn't seem to be any higher at baseline, and actually seems to be lower post-training because their muscles are more adapted to training, so there's less damage and all that. So just like on paper, if you just look at muscle protein synthesis, I can't see any good reason that people shouldn't keep being able to grow indefinitely forever. So like the question then becomes like, okay, so what might be the bottleneck? Like why can't you just be a natty, and if you put in 50 years of training, eventually look like Ronnie Coleman? Like, I think that if you haven't thought about this question, that sounds ludicrous because, like, oh yeah, of course, people lift weights for a while, gains eventually slow way down and probably stop at some point. You hit your genetic limit, blah blah blah. But like, people don't think why. Like mechanistically, why don't muscles keep growing? And so, one of the potential bottlenecks is myonuclei. So there's something called myonuclear domain theory. And so essentially what myonuclei are is that most cells in your body have a nucleus, and the nucleus, people refer to it as like the control center of the cell or whatever. But basically it holds your DNA that is then used to make RNA and all of the proteins for the cell to do whatever it needs to do. Muscle fibers, on the other hand, are very rare in that they're multinucleated cells. So they have many nuclei like per muscle fiber. And it seems, so referring to something called myonuclear domain theory, it seems that essentially each nucleus oversees a given amount of sarcoplasm, and that there seems to be an upper limit on the amount of sarcoplasm essentially that each nucleus can oversee and code proteins for and all that. And that when you reach your myonuclear domain limit, like once each myonucleus is overseen and controlling as much of the sarcoplasm as it can. You probably need to accrue more myonuclei, or else you're going to stop growing. And so the direct, and so again, like I wouldn't necessarily claim that is for sure the reason that people eventually stop growing, like eventually just stop fusing myonuclei. But that does at least seem to be one potential explanation of what would eventually bottleneck hypertrophy. And so then the question becomes, like, how do you actually like activate more satellite cells and then get them to donate their nuclei so then you can accrue more myonuclei? And the details are pretty hazy, but that process seems to be related, at least in some degree, to muscle damage. And one thing we know is that with increased training experience, muscle damage decreases quite substantially. And so the hypothesis I made is that if you've been training for a while and you feel like you've been doing everything right, but you are just plateaued super hard and just not gaining anything, it may be worth trying to take some time off, decondition your muscles, so then when you come back, when you start training again, it will cause more muscle damage, and maybe that will help with some additional myonuclear accretion and then help you grow a little bit more. And just, maybe just repeat the process. And obviously that's not going to be quantitatively the same as growing like a new lifter, because they just grow like weeds when they touch a bar, but like qualitatively similar in that you're getting your muscles into a state where they're going to be more easily damaged, and that might help with myonuclear accretion, which might help you continue gradually making progress when it seems you had finally hit a hard plateau. So yeah, like I presented that as a hypothesis and laid out the evidence for why I felt that was a plausible hypothesis. And I think a lot of people interpreted it as Greg is saying that this is absolutely what happens and is how everyone should train. And that is not how I meant for it to be interpreted. So yeah, I need to rework that article, and less because of any like strictly factual issues, and more just due to communication and perceptual issues. Because I feel like what I wanted to say was clear to me, but a lot of people clearly didn't take away from the article what I meant for them to take away from it. So I feel like I need to go back and rework it so what I meant to say is more obvious.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I think I pretty much asked you all of my nerdy questions. So I guess just to wrap this whole thing up, like if someone is listening to this who, maybe has been training for 1+ years at least, and is, like somewhat trained but is not super jacked yet and wants to proceed with the best kind of practical guidelines possible, like what sort of frequency and volume would you say this person should be starting out and then moving forward from there?
Sure. So I think I got enough of it that time to answer. Just for anyone listening, we've been having internet connectivity issues, and so if I'm attempting to answer a question and it seems like the question I'm answering is not the one that Abel asked, it's not because I'm a complete idiot. I'm only partially an idiot. Part of it is just I'm not 100% sure what he's saying every time. So I apologize for that. So I think you're asking like kind of for a intermediate trainee, kind of what levels of volume and frequency would I recommend? For someone who's just purely focused on hypertrophy, I think that somewhere in the neighborhood of like 15 to 25 sets per muscle group per week is probably a pretty decent place to start. If you want to be conservative, start on the lower end of that range of around 15 sets per muscle group per week, and know that you probably have room to work up from there. And in terms of frequency, I think that from a practical perspective, just in terms of training splits that makes sense to people, either a frequency of twice per week or 3 times per week is probably a pretty good place to start. You probably could just train everything every day, but that tends to make workouts like kind of unwieldy because you're kind of having to go all around the gym and fight for a bunch of equipment. And I think that as with most things, there are probably decreases in marginal utility for frequency past a point, especially with hypertrophy. So 2-3 times per week, maybe 4 times per week. Something that is easy to implement for twice per week would just be like a push-pull legs split. Push one day, pull one day, legs one day, repeat that again. You're in the gym 6 days per week. You have a frequency of twice per week for all major muscle groups. For a frequency of 3 times per week, it could just be an upper-lower split with, upper day 1, lower day 2, upper day 3, lower day 4, upper day 5, lower day 6. And that gets the job done. And then past that, if you want to do frequencies of like 4 or 5 times per week, you need to be a little bit more creative with your splits. And so I think 2 or 3 times per week is probably good enough for most people just because it makes planning easier. For someone who's primarily focused on strength, I think that, so assuming you're a power lifter, I think that frequency probably matters the least for deadlift, may matter to some degree, but not a ton for squat. Actually, when I say it matters the least for deadlift, I more so mean deadlift should generally be lowish frequency. So I think that may have like an inverse effect. I just don't know that many great deadlifters who deadlift more than twice per week. And I can't think of any that deadlift like 4 or 5 times per week. And for bench, I think that frequency is quite important. So I'd recommend a frequency for deadlift of once or twice per week. And if you deadlift twice per week, typically like 1 pretty hard session and 1 easier session. For squat, 2 or 3 times per week seems to be the sweet spot for a lot of people. But there are also absolutely very, very good squatters who only squat once per week. Like I believe Ray Williams squats once per week because apparently it takes a while to recover from squatting 1,000 pounds. I've heard. I wouldn't know anything about that. So yeah, like I don't think frequency matters quite as much for squats. Just in terms of what I've observed personally, 2 or 3 times per week seems to get the job done for most folks. And then for bench, there are really strong people with a pretty low bench frequency, but I would start most folks on a frequency of 3 or 4 times per week. If they know that they have issues recovering from bench workouts, like maybe their shoulders or like pec tendons are really sore for several days after a hard bench workout, maybe start them on twice per week. But I tend to think that 3 or 4 times per week is a good place to generally start bench frequency. And then volume. So with hypertrophy, I was kind of working with the assumption that all of the sets would be either going to failure or at least pretty close to failure. For strength, I think volume in terms of sets per week is heavily dependent on how close to failure you're training. With like a Shako approach, you're generally like you're almost always 2+ reps from failure and typically 3+ reps from failure. And like, geez, the volume on those programs can just absolutely be gnarly just in terms of the number of sets you're doing, just because like you're inducing a little bit less stress per set. So it's harder to give like concrete volume recommendations, but I think that if you're going pretty close to failure most of the time, I think you can get away with a little bit lower volume than the recommendations for like hypertrophy, just because the marginal benefits for increased volume on strength gains seem to be smaller than the marginal benefits of increased volume for hypertrophy. So yeah, I think instead of like maybe 15 to 25 sets per week, a good place to start would be maybe closer to 10 to 15 sets per week for deadlift and squat. Again, if you're going pretty close to failure, and for bench, I think it can be higher, like maybe in the 20, 25 range. Then if you're not going particularly close to failure per set, like all bets are off. You can do a ton of sets. And I think at that point, there's just so much individual variability. It's hard to give like concrete numbers, but you can probably take the other recommendations and roughly double them. And before anyone crucifies me for that, like you may have just heard like 20 sets of bench if you're going reasonably close to failure. So are you saying 40 sets of bench? Like just give it a try before you knock it. If you're training with like 80% of your max, like sets of 3 or 4 just aren't the same as sets of like 6, 7, 8. So yeah, like I think that weekly number of sets can be quite high if you're not going super close to failure.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, Greg, thank you so much. You dropped a ton of cool knowledge. Just one random thing that I want to ask you at the beginning or at the end, because I've been consuming a lot of Jordan Peterson content as of late,
Okay.
and he always talks about IQ. And I remember talking about some test result of yours in the past or something. Would you know by any chance what your IQ value is?
I do. I don't know. So I might be the one in the wrong here. I just feel like that's a weird thing to talk about publicly, and I wouldn't want people to look at me differently. And also like just so like my intention is clear here. I think that people who like openly talk about having a high IQ, I think that has a strong potential to be misheard. Because I think that it either comes across as like people bragging, which if someone's bragging about their IQ, they're a fucking idiot. Because like I think that if you're going to brag about something, you brag about something that it took like effort or skill to accomplish. And IQ is like 80+% heritable. So like you had virtually nothing to do with your IQ number. So I wouldn't want it to be perceived as bragging. And I think that people who do talk about their IQ in a bragging way are ironically just fucking idiots. And the other thing is I think that apart from it sounding like bragging, I think it can come across as someone implying that they're better than other people. And I think that comes from maybe either the speaker or the listener misunderstanding what IQ is. It's not synonymous with smarts. It's more synonymous with just like horsepower, I guess. So like if you're set to figure out like a set of novel problems that primarily are predicated on like really more pattern recognition skill than anything else, then people with higher IQs tend to be able to do those types of tasks a little bit better and a little bit faster. But it's not synonymous with general smarts. So I think people who talk about their IQ number as if it makes them better than anyone else fundamentally don't understand what they're talking about. So yeah, I think that is a thorny issue. And so I just elect to not discuss it publicly.
Sure. Well, that was so interesting what you just said at the beginning that I'll leave this final section in because I think you just shared some information on the topic that most people wouldn't know. So yeah, Greg, with that, I just want to ask you where people can find your work and new projects, anything that you're working on. Just feel free to plug.
So you can find my writing at strongerbyscience.com. Most of my stuff these days is in mass. That's not because I'm trying to squeeze people into paying for my content. It's more that since I'm currently in grad school, I just don't have much time to put out a ton of free content, which is unfortunate because that's ultimately what I love doing the most. But yeah, so mass, monthly applications, and strength sport research review I do with Eric Helms and Mike Sordos, breaking down the research that's going to be the most useful and relevant for strength and physique athletes. It's an awesome resource. You can check that. Well, I think it's an awesome resource. I'm obviously biased. Hopefully you will too, though. You can find that at strongerbyscience.com/mass. And then past that, I'm reasonably active on Facebook and somewhat active on Instagram. And I'm just Greg Nuckols, both of those places.
Perfect. Greg, thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I had a blast.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and liked what you heard. And if you did, then I think you'd definitely love our SSD training and nutritional course that we recently put out with Børge Fagerli. This program not only contains a 12-week phasic training program that you can use to time efficiently and safely build the best body you can, but also gives you 4+ hours of video lectures about managing your nutrition and lifestyle to not only look good, but feel and perform optimally. And besides this, you will also be getting some really awesome bonuses like Børge Fagerli's MyoReps and Zero Carb ebook. So if this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and check out sustainableselfdevelopment.com/SSD program. And of course, to not miss out on future episodes like this, subscribe to the podcast and you'll be up to date on everything we'll be putting out. So thank you for hanging around up until now, and see you next time.